In the autumn of 1841, in Madison County, Mississippi, such knowledge belonged to a woman named Hannah. On the Riverside estate, she was, though few would dare admit it, the most feared person there. For 23 years, Hannah had worked in the plantation kitchen. The structure stood apart from the main house, isolated, as the owner, Edward Collier, liked to explain to visitors, for fear of fire. But those who labored there understood the separation differently. The kitchen was its own dominion, and within its walls, Hannah governed with calm, unwavering authority. Her education had not come from books. It had come from watching, listening, and surviving. She knew every dangerous plant that grew on the property, not because she sought harm, but because knowledge gathered itself over time, through quiet observation and hushed exchanges among those who worked the land. She knew which mushrooms would bring on relentless vomiting, which berries could still a heart in hours, which crushed seeds could imitate the symptoms of natural illness so convincingly that no physician would question the cause. The white oleander by the garden path, the Jimson weed tangled in the cotton rows, castor beans grown for their oil, the foxglove blooming purple and deceptively beautiful in the medicinal garden Mrs. Collier tended with such pride. Hannah understood them all. Her lessons were written in loss. She had seen a child die after confusing nightshade for wild grapes. She had watched a field hand collapse from handling water hemlock while clearing irrigation ditches. She had observed Mrs. Collier measure out tonics and tinctures, noting through repetition which plants restored strength and which merely prolonged suffering before death claimed its due. Over the years, this knowledge became something more than information. It became protection. In a world where she owned nothing, not her labor, not her time, not even her own body, what she knew was the only possession no one could take. She did not think of it as a weapon. She thought of it as a secret weight in her hand, like a coin pressed into her palm and never spent. The Riverside Plantation stretched across nearly 2,000 acres of fertile bottomland along the Pearl River. Cotton filled most of the fields, though Edward Collier had recently embarked on an ambitious sugar venture, convinced he could rival the great estates of Louisiana, despite the skepticism of neighboring planters. 87 people lived and worked there, their days governed by harvest cycles, by the moods of the Collier family, and by the harsh arithmetic of profit that reduced human lives to figures in a ledger. Hannah's role in the kitchen offered her a fragile form of security. She was too essential to be sent into the fields, too skilled to be easily replaced. The Colliers had purchased her at auction in Natchez when she was 14, after their previous cook succumbed to fever. The auctioneer had boasted of her training in a French-influenced household in New Orleans, a claim more embellished than true. In reality, she had worked in the scullery of such a home, learning not through instruction, but by watching carefully and remembering everything. Yet Hannah possessed something rarer than formal schooling, an instinctive command of flavor, heat, and timing. From simple ingredients, she crafted meals that drew admiration from the Colliers' guests. Edward Collier prided himself on his table. Lavish dinners were his chosen instrument for cultivating alliances with factors, merchants, and politicians whose favor could determine the future of his enterprise. And so, while power seemed to reside in the grand house overlooking the fields, another, quieter power stood over simmering pots and glowing coals. In the separate kitchen at Riverside, Hannah tended more than meals. She tended knowledge, silent, patient, and dangerous the moment it chose to step into the light. Hannah's abilities served his ambitions, which meant she was fed better than others, allowed to sleep in a small room attached to the kitchen rather than in the quarters, and spared the worst of the physical punishments that punctuated life on the estate. This relative privilege created distance between Hannah and the others. Some resented her perceived advantages, Others understood that her position came with its own dangers, that proximity to the main house meant constant surveillance, that the standards expected of her left no room for human weakness or error. She maintained carefully calibrated relationships with everyone, respectful deference toward the Collars, professional courtesy with Thomas Barrett, the white overseer who managed the daily operations, distant but not unfriendly interactions with the house servants, practical exchanges with those who worked the gardens and livestock, trading kitchen scraps, and occasional favors for the freshest produce and meat, only with Dinah, who worked as seamstress and occasional lady's maid. To Mrs. Collier, did Hannah allow something approaching friendship? They had arrived at Riverside within months of each other, both young and terrified, both learning to navigate a world of unspoken rules and sudden violence. Over the years, they had developed a shorthand communication that required few words, able to convey warnings and reassurances with a glance or the tilt of a head. It was Dinah who first noticed something had changed in the main house. Mrs. Collier requested 3 dresses be let out. Dinah mentioned quietly one evening in late September, standing in the kitchen doorway while Hannah prepared the next day's bread dough. She said, "She's been retaining water," but Hannah's hands continued their rhythmic kneading, but her attention sharpened. "But I heard her being sick this morning. 4th time this week." The two women's eyes met. In that silent exchange passed an understanding of what this might mean and what consequences it might bring. Catherine Collier was 32 years old and had been married to Edward for 14 years. In that time she had given birth to 3 children, Margaret now 12, Edward Jr. 9, and Thomas, who would have been 7 but had died of fever 3 years earlier. The loss of Thomas had devastated Catherine, plunging her into a melancholy that had lasted months, from which she had emerged changed, quieter, more distant, prone to headaches and nervous complaints. If Catherine was pregnant again, it would alter the household's dynamics in ways both obvious and subtle. It might soften Edward's increasingly short temper, giving him hope for another son. It might deepen Catherine's anxiety, given her age and the memory of her loss. It might shift attention away from other matters that had been building tension in the house. Matters like Edward's frequent trips to Charleston and New Orleans, which some whispered had purposes beyond business, like the gambling debts that Thomas Barrett had mentioned to the house servants, thinking his words wouldn't travel, like the pressure Edward had been putting on his cotton factors to advance more credit against future harvests, a dangerous practice that had ruined other planters. Hannah had learned to recognize patterns, to sense when instability threatened to erupt into crisis. The Collier household had been moving towards some kind of breaking point for months, like storm clouds gathering on a humid afternoon. A pregnancy might diffuse that tension, or it might accelerate it. She couldn't yet tell which. "I'll make her ginger tea," Hannah said Fina. "Lily, the kind that settles the stomach." Dinah nodded, understanding this response for what it was. An acknowledgement of the information, a commitment to careful observation, a promise to talk more when circumstances allowed. After Dinah left, Hannah continued working the dough with mechanical precision, while her mind ranged over everything she knew about the household's current state. She had developed the habit of collecting information the way she collected herbs, carefully, systematically storing each piece away for potential future use, even when she couldn't yet see how it might be applied. She knew that Edward had argued with his brother Charles over money matters during Charles's visit last month. She knew that Margaret had been caught reading abolitionist literature smuggled in by the tutor Edward had hired, causing a scandal that resulted in the tutor's immediate dismissal. She knew that Edward Jr. had developed a cruel streak, tormenting the house cats and once attempting to burn a nest of baby mice alive until Catherine had stopped him. She knew that Thomas Barrett had started drinking more heavily, his morning rounds increasingly erratic. And she knew that over the past 6 months, 3 people on the estate had died under circumstances that, while not impossible, seemed unlikely. The first had been old Samuel, who had been past 70 and suffered from a weak heart. He had collapsed in the fields on a brutally hot day in June. The physician who examined him had declared it apoplexy, entirely expected given Samuel's age and the temperature. The second had been 19-year-old Ruth, who had been pregnant and begun bleeding heavily one night in July. She had died before morning. The same physician had concluded it was a miscarriage gone wrong, a tragedy, but not uncommon. The third had been Jonas, one of the field drivers who worked under Thomas Barrett's soup, Riven. He had complained of severe stomach pain after the midday meal in August, vomited repeatedly, and died that same evening. The physician had suggested food poisoning, perhaps spoiled meat in the heat. 3 deaths in 3 months on an estate of fewer than 90 people. Perhaps it meant nothing. Death was common enough, claiming young and old, without pattern or mercy. But something about the timing bothered Hannah, a dissonance she couldn't quite name. She had cooked the meal that Jonas ate before he died. The pork had been fresh, butchered that morning. The vegetables had come from the garden, no different from what she'd served dozens of times before. She had tasted everything herself before sending it to the fields. As she always did, nothing had been wrong with that food. So why had Jonas died? The question haunted her through the following days as she went about her routine, rising before dawn to start the kitchen fire, preparing the simple breakfast of cornmeal mush that would be distributed to those working the fields, beginning the more elaborate preparations for the main house meals, the hot breads and preserved fruits, and carefully seasoned meats that Edward demanded for his table. She moved through these tasks with the efficiency of long practice, her hands working while her mind wandered through darker territory. She found herself studying the Collier family with new attention during the meals she served, noting details she had previously dismissed as routine household tensions. The way Edward barely looked at Catherine during breakfast, his attention fixed on the newspaper or his account books. The way Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. How she had started wearing gloves, even inside the house, as if trying to hide something. The way Margaret watched her parents, with an expression Hannah couldn't quite interpret. Not childish ignorance, but something older, more knowing, almost calculating. And Edward Jr., who had started spending time in the kitchen, ostensibly fascinated by the cooking process, but asking questions that made Hannah uncomfortable. "Do you ever make mistakes?" he had asked one afternoon, watching her chop vegetables with rapid precision. "Put in the wrong ingredient." "No, Master Edward," Hannah had replied carefully. "I'm very careful with everything I prepare. But what if you did? What if you mixed up sugar and salt, or used the wrong herb?" "That wouldn't happen, Master Edward. I know every ingredient in this kitchen, every single one." His eyes had gleamed with something Hannah recognized as dangerous curiosity. Even the things in Mother's still room, the medicine plant she keeps. Hannah had set down her knife, giving him her full attention. "I only use what belongs in the kitchen, Master Edward. Your mother's medicines are her concern, not mine." He had seemed disappointed by this answer, lingering a few more minutes before wandering away. But the exchange had left Hannah unsettled, adding another piece to the puzzle she was unconsciously assembling. That evening, after the dinner service had been completed and the main house had settled into lamplight and quiet routine, Hannah made a decision that would change everything. She retrieved the key she wasn't supposed to have, a duplicate she had made years ago by pressing the original into soft wax. Then having the blacksmith create a copy in exchange for extra portions, and keeping certain things to himself. She unlocked Mrs. Collier's still room. The space was small and organized with meticulous care. Shelves lined with bottles and jars, labeled in Catherine's careful hand, lavender for nerves, chamomile for sleep, willow bark for pain, digitalis from the foxglove used in tiny amounts for heart complaints, belladonna for stomach cramps, measured in drops so dilute they were barely present. All the medicines were accounted for, their levels appearing normal for household use. But there, on the bottom shelf, hidden behind larger containers, Hannah found something that made her blood run cold. A jar labeled Arsenic for Rats, its contents reduced by nearly half since she had last glimpsed it months ago, during one of Mrs. Collier's occasional requests for Hannah to fetch something from the room. Arsenic, the rat poison that in small doses administered over time could cause symptoms indistinguishable from natural illness, stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, death. Hannah stood frozen in that still room, holding the jar with trembling hands, understanding with terrible clarity that she had just crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The knowledge she carried had always been theoretical, defensive, things she knew in order to protect herself from accidental harm. But now she was standing in a locked room, holding evidence of something far more sinister, forced to confront possibilities that turned her stomach even as her mind raced through the implications. Who had been using the arsenic? Who had access to this room besides Catherine? What if the 3 deaths hadn't been coincidental after all? What if someone in the main house had been killing people? And what if they knew that Hannah had figured it out? She replaced the jar exactly as she had found it, locked the still room, and returned to her small room in the kitchen building. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, she lay in darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the estate settling around her, understanding that she now possessed the most dangerous kind of knowledge, truth about murder, without any safe way to speak it. The morning after her discovery, Hannah moved through her duties with exaggerated normalcy, terrified that any deviation from routine might betray what she knew. Her hands prepared food with their usual efficiency, but her mind worked feverishly, examining the past months from this new, terrible perspective. If someone had been using arsenic to kill, they had been clever about it. The deaths had been spaced out, affecting different types of people. An elderly man, a young woman, a strong field hand. Nothing to suggest a pattern to anyone not looking for one. And arsenic, she knew from overheard conversations between Catherine and visiting ladies discussing pest control, was nearly impossible to detect after death. Physicians would see the symptoms and conclude natural causes, never thinking to suspect murder. But who would have motive to kill Samuel, Ruth, and Jonas? What connected 3 people from different parts of the plantation hierarchy? Hannah had learned over the years that information flowed through the estate along invisible channels, carried by those whose presence was so constant they became nearly invisible themselves. House servants heard conversations the Collars forgot they were having. Field workers observed interactions during the overseer's rounds. Children repeated things without understanding their significance. If Hannah positioned herself carefully at these intersection points, she could map the estate's true dynamics beneath its surface appearance. She started by approaching Marcus, who worked as stable hand, and thus had access to conversations that took place during arrivals and departures when people's guards were down. "Marcus," she said quietly, catching him as he brought fresh water to the kitchen. "I've been thinking about Jonas. Did he seem troubled before he died?" "Fighting with anyone." Marcus paused, his expression becoming guarded. People had learned to be careful when discussing the dead, particularly when their deaths might reflect poorly on estate's management. But he and Hannah had known each other for years, long enough that he trusted her not to use information carelessly. "Not fighting exactly," he said slowly, "but he'd been complaining to Thomas Barrett about the field assignments. Thought Barrett was playing favorites, giving easier work to some while running others harder. Did Barrett change anything after Jonas complained? Made it worse. Gave Jonas the worst sections, the land with most stumps to clear. It was like he was punishing him. Marcus's face tightened, but Jonas was strong, could handle hard work. What he couldn't handle was— He trailed off, glancing toward the main house. "What?" Hannah pressed. "There were rumors," Marcus said finally, his voice dropping even lower. "About Jonas and one of the house girls. About them being caught together somewhere they shouldn't have been. About Mr. Keir being furious. The implication hung heavy between them. Such situations rarely ended well for those involved. If Edward had discovered a liaison between Jonas and one of the house servants, particularly if it had been consensual, it would have been seen as theft of his property's time and reproductive potential. The usual response would be swift and public punishment meant to discourage others. But there had been no public punishment. Jonas had simply died suddenly and painfully. His death attributed to bad meat. "Which house girl?" Hannah asked. Marcus shook his head. "Don't know if it was true, just rumors." But the next day, Hannah noticed something she had missed before. 16-year-old Lily, who worked primarily as Catherine's personal maid, had been given additional outdoor duties, working in the vegetable garden, hauling water, tasks that kept her visible and supervised, rather than inside the house where private moments might be possible. It was the kind of reassignment that looked like Norma, work distribution, but functioned as punishment and control. Hannah found Lily alone in the garden late one afternoon, using the pretense of selecting herbs for that evening's meal to position herself nearby. She said nothing at first, simply working in parallel, allowing her presence to become comfortable before attempting conversation. Finally, Lily spoke first. "You knew Jonas." It wasn't a question. Hannah nodded, continuing to examine mint leaves. "Did he say anything to you?" Lily's voice was barely audible. "Before he died." "No," Hannah said truthfully. "But I remember him as a good person, someone who tried to do right by others." Lily's hands stilled in the dirt. He was he. She paused, wrestling with something. "We were going to run." He had been saving money from selling carved wood pieces to some of the hands, had almost enough to buy supplies. "We were going to try for Ohio. I'd heard about a route through Tennessee." Anna's chest tightened. The escape attempt would have been nearly impossible, discovered within days and punished with savage certainty. But she understood the desperation that drove such plans, the calculation that even slim chances of freedom might be worth risking everything. "When were you planning to go?" "August. Right after the lay-by, when everyone's exhausted and discipline gets looser." Lily's voice wavered. "Then Jonas got sick." "Died so fast." "And you think it wasn't natural?" Hannah finished quietly. Lily's silence was answer enough. Hannah returned to the kitchen with her herbs and a deepening sense of dread. If Jonas had been killed to prevent an escape attempt, it suggested that someone had known about the plan. But how? Had Jonas confided in the wrong person? Had he and Lily been overheard during one of their clandestine meetings? That night, she questioned Dina about Jonas and Lily, choosing her words carefully.
"I saw Lily crying."
"In the garden today," Hannah said, while Dina helped clean after dinner. "She's still grieving Jonas." Dina glanced toward the main house before responding. "Mrs. Collier mentioned something about it to Mr. Collier last month. I was adjusting her dress when he came into the room. She said she'd seen Lily slipping out at odd hours. Thought maybe she was meeting someone. Asked him to look into it." "What did he say?" "That he would handle it." Dinah's expression was troubled. This was maybe 2 days before Jonas died. The timeline aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. If Edward had discovered the relationship and the escape plan, Jonas's death made terrible sense, not as punishment, but as prevention, disguised as natural illness to avoid the questions and attention that a public execution might bring from neighbors or authorities. But this still left the other 2 deaths unexplained. What had Samuel and Ruth done to merit murder? Or were they killed for different reasons entirely? Hannah spent the following week in a state of hypervigilance, observing everything while trying to appear normally occupied. She noticed that Catherine had indeed stopped vomiting in the mornings, confirming the pregnancy. Edward's mood had improved slightly, though he still spent long hours in his study, reviewing account books with expressions that suggested the numbers weren't cooperating with his wishes. Margaret had become more withdrawn, spending hours in her room reading when she wasn't helping Catherine with household management tasks. Edward Jr. continued his disturbing interests, recently fascinated by the butchering process, and asking Hannah detailed questions about anatomy that she deflected with vague non-answers. And Thomas Barrett had started appearing at the kitchen door more frequently, sometimes asking for coffee, sometimes just standing there watching Hannah work with an intense itty that made her skin crawl. "You're a clever woman," he said one afternoon, startling her. She hadn't heard him approach. Very attentive to details, Hannah kept her focus on the vegetables she was preparing. "Just trying to do my work properly, Mr. Barrett. I'm sure you are." He didn't move from the doorway. "Noticed you've been asking questions lately about Jonas, about others." Curiosity. Her heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady, just trying to understand what happened. Jonas ate food I prepared. When someone dies after eating my cooking, I need to know it wasn't something I did wrong. The physician said it was spoiled meat. The meat wasn't spoiled. I checked it carefully like I always do. Barrett was quiet for a long moment. Maybe he ate something else. Something not from your kitchen. Hannah finally looked up, meeting his eyes. What she saw there made her blood run cold. A kind of calculation, an assessment of threat level, a decision being made in real time about how much danger she represented. "Maybe," she agreed carefully, returning to her work. "Poison, same as the Collier girl." This time, Edward's rage found a target. He ordered Lily's small room searched, and Thomas Barrett discovered hidden beneath her mattress a small vial of arsenic taken from Catherine's still room. She confessed before she lost consciousness. Barrett announced to the assembled household, his face hard. Said she'd been planning to escape and wanted to take revenge on the family for Jonas's death. Poisoned Miss Margaret thinking she was getting back at the master. Then tried to kill herself when she realized what she'd done. The story was convenient. Too convenient. Hannah knew immediately that it was fabricated, that Lily had been framed, that the real killer was using her as a scapegoat to end the investigation. But what could Hannah say? If she challenged Barrett's narrative, she would have to explain how she knew it was false, which would mean revealing her own investigation, her stolen key, her understanding of the killings. She would be condemning herself to save a girl who was already dying. Lily never regained consciousness. She died that evening, and Barrett ordered her body buried immediately in the estate cemetery's far corner, the area reserved for those who had died in disgrace. At the burial, Hannah stood at a distance, watching them lower Lily's body into the ground, feeling the weight of her own cowardice like stones in her chest. She had known Lily was in danger. The girl had tried to warn her that something might happen, and Hannah had done nothing because saving Lily would have required sacrificing herself. But as earth was shoveled onto Lily's grave, Hannah made a decision. She would not let this stand. She would not allow the real killer to escape justice by using a dead 16-year-old as a scapegoat. Even if it destroyed her, she would find a way to expose the truth. She started by revisiting everything she knew, examining it from new angles. If Lily had been framed, someone had planted that arsenic vial in her room. Who had access? Barrett. Certainly he had conducted the search, but he would have needed the arsenic first, which meant access to Catherine's still room. Hannah returned to that locked room late one night, her heart pounding with each step. The still room was exactly as she'd seen it before, except for one crucial detail. The arsenic jar was now empty. All of it had been used or removed. She stood there in the darkness, understanding flooding through her like ice water. The killer had used up all the arsenic. First on Samuel, Ruth, and Jonas, then on Margaret, and finally framing Lily. There was no more poison to trace, no more evidence to find, unless Hannah could prove that someone had access to the still room, beyond Catherine. She examined the room more carefully, looking for any sign that others had been there, and finally pressed into the soft wood of the doorframe at child height. She found something, a small carved initial, E.J. Edward, Jr. The boy had been in the still room. He had carved his initial into the wood the way children do, marking territory, claiming ownership of forbidden spaces. Hannah thought back to all his disturbing behaviors, his questions about cooking mistakes and medicine plants, his fascination with death and suffering, his strange lack of grief after Margaret's death. What if the killer wasn't Edward or Catherine or Barrett? What if it was a 9-year-old boy who had somehow gained access to his mother's medicines and was killing for reasons an adult mind couldn't comprehend? The idea seemed impossible. Children didn't commit systematic murder, except Hannah remembered stories traded among the slaves on neighboring estates, whispered accounts of disturbed children who hurt animals, siblings, even themselves. She remembered one cook describing a planter's son who had poisoned his own family because he'd been punished for something minor, his child mind unable to process consequences beyond immediate revenge. What if Edward Jr. had killed Samuel for some slight Hannah didn't know about? What if he'd killed Ruth because she'd reported some misbehavior to his parents? What if Jonas had caught him doing something inappropriate and threatened to tell? And Margaret, his own sister, had she discovered his secrets? Had she threatened to expose him? The pattern fit. A child would kill without the careful planning of an adult, would choose victims based on immediate emotional responses rather than strategic necessity. A child with access to the still room, perhaps stealing his mother's key or having a copy made, could poison people without the systematic cause. Plantation an adult would employ, but proving it was another matter. No one would believe the word of a slave over a white child, particularly a child of the estate's owners. If Hannah accused Edward Jr. without absolute proof, she would be executed for slander, probably tortured first to confess to being the real killer. She needed evidence so overwhelming that even Edward couldn't ignore it. The opportunity came 3 days later when Edward Jr. approached her in the kitchen, watching her work with his usual unsettling intensity. "You knew Lily was going to die," he said conversationally. Hannah's hands stuttered in their rhythm before she caught herself. "I didn't know anything of the sort, Master Edward." "Yes, you did, I could tell. You weren't surprised when they found her sick." "I was very surprised and very sad." "No, you weren't." He moved closer, his child's face wearing an expression far too knowing. "You know lots of things. You know about poisons and medicines. You know which plants are dangerous." Hannah set down her knife carefully, giving him her full attention. "Your mother knows much more about those things than I do." "Master Edward, Mother's asleep most of the time now. She doesn't pay attention, but you pay attention to everything." He smiled. "That's why you're still alive." The threat was unmistakable despite his casual tone. Hannah felt ice running through her veins, but kept her expression neutral. "I just try to do my work properly, Master Edward. I think you do more than that. I think you understand exactly what's been happening." He tilted his head, studying her like a predator assessing prey. "But you can't tell anyone, can you? Because they'd never believe you. They'd think you were lying to save yourself. He was 9 years old and understood the dynamics of power and credibility with terrifying clarity. I don't know what you mean, Master Edward. Yes, you do. Bew. It's all right. I won't hurt you. You're too useful. Besides, it's more interesting having someone who knows. Like a game. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Margaret was going to tell father about the cat. She said I was sick, that I needed to be sent away to a school that could fix me. I couldn't let her do that. Hannah's breath caught. He had just confessed to murdering his sister, said it as casually as if commenting on the weather, secure in the knowledge that Hannah's word against his would mean her death, not his. Why are you telling me this? Hannah asked quietly. Edward Jr.'s smile widened. Because you already knew, and because I want someone to understand how clever I've been. Adults think children are stupid, but we're not. We just have to be more careful. What about the others? Samuel? Ruth? Jonas? Samuel was boring and talked too much about things that weren't his business. Ruth caught me in Mother's still room and threatened to tell Jonas. He paused, thinking. Jonas was just practice. I wanted to see if I could do it in the fields, make it look like bad food from your kitchen. It worked perfectly. Hannah felt sick listening to this recitation of murder, delivered in a child's voice. And Lily. She was convenient. Everyone already suspected her because of Jonas. It was easy to put Mother's key under her mattress with the empty arsenic bottle and tell Mr. Barrett that I'd seen her acting suspicious. Did Barrett know what you were doing? Of course not. None of them know. They're all too busy suspecting each other. He laughed, a sound that belonged to no child Hannah had ever known. Father thinks Mother might have done it. Mother thinks Father is capable of anything. Barrett thinks they're both involved. It's entertaining watching them. He left then, leaving Hannah standing in the kitchen with trembling hands, finally understanding the full horror of her situation. She had discovered the killer, had heard his confession, and was now more trapped than ever. She couldn't report him without condemning herself. She couldn't kill him without the same result. She couldn't escape. Where would she run? And who would protect her from the law's inevitable pursuit? She was trapped in a house with a child murderer who had confessed to her specifically because he knew she was powerless to stop him. That night, Hannah lay awake in her room, turning the problem over from every angle. She had promised herself she would expose the truth, even if it destroyed her, but now she faced a truth so unthinkable that speaking it would accomplish nothing except her own execution. What would Josiah do? What would someone with more experience navigating impossible situations choose? The answer came to her slowly built from pieces of conversations, observations, and hard-won wisdom about surviving in a world designed to destroy people like her. She couldn't expose Edward Jr. directly, but she might be able to protect future victims and create circumstances that would eventually reveal the truth without requiring her testimony. The next morning, Hannah began implementing a plan that required patience, precision, and tremendous faith that she hadn't misjudged the remaining decent people at Riverside Estate. She started with the still room, using her key for what she promised herself would be the last time. She entered that small space and systematically contaminated every remaining poisonous substance. She added ingredients that would cause obvious, immediate illness if ingested, violent vomiting, distinctive rashes, symptoms so dramatic that they couldn't be mistaken for natural illness and would require physician intervention. She did this carefully, ensuring that anyone consuming even small amounts would become sick quickly, but not Atterley. If Edward Jr. tried to kill again using Catherine's medicines, the attempt would fail spectacularly and draw immediate attention to the still room and its accessibility. Next, she approached Josiah, choosing her words with extraordinary care. I need advice, she said. sitting beside him outside his cabin on a Sunday afternoon when others were occupied with rest or prayer. If someone knew about wrongdoing, but couldn't speak of it without condemning themselves, what should they do? Josiah's carving knife paused. That's an even more dangerous question than the last one you asked me. I know, but I'm out of options. He studied her for a long moment. Does this wrongdoing put others in immediate danger? It might. I'm trying to prevent it. Can you do that without exposing yourself? I'm trying, but I need someone to know certain things just in case. Not specific accusations, just directions to look if something happens to me. Josiah sat down his carving. Tell me what you need me to know. Hannah spoke for nearly an hour, laying out a careful narrative of facts, without direct accusations. She described the pattern of deaths, the missing arsenic, the access to the still room, the carved initials she'd found. She never mentioned Edward Jr. by name, but she provided enough information that an intelligent person examining the situation would eventually reach the right conclusion. If I die suddenly, she finished, I need someone to tell Edward Collier's brother Charles about all of this. Write it down if you can. Send it somehow. Charles wanted someone to investigate Edward's management of the estate. If he learns about these deaths, the circumstances, the evidence of poison, he'll have grounds to challenge Edward's ownership even more strongly. He'll hire proper investigators, people who can ask questions I can't. And if they investigate, they'll eventually realize the truth, Josiah said slowly. Even without your testimony. That's what I'm hoping. You're taking a terrible risk. If anyone discovers what you've done to those medicines, I know, but I can't let it continue. I can't watch more people die while staying silent because I'm afraid. Josiah reached out and placed his weathered hand over hers, a gesture of solidarity so rare and precious that Hannah felt tears threaten. I'll remember everything you've told me, and I'll make sure Charles Collier learns of it if needed. You have my word. Thank you. He squeezed her hand briefly before releasing it. Hannah, be careful. Whatever you're planning, be very careful. She returned to her kitchen and resumed her duties, outwardly unchanged, but carrying a small measure of comfort that someone knew. Someone would act. If she was killed, someone would eventually ensure justice, even if she didn't survive to see it. 3 days later, Edward Jr. appeared at the kitchen door again. I need you to make me something, he said with his disturbing smile. A special tea. Mother's complained that the one she makes herself isn't helping her morning sickness anymore. I want to give her something that will make her feel better. Hannah's blood ran cold. Catherine was his next target. Perhaps she had discovered something. Perhaps she had started questioning him. Perhaps he simply wanted to see if he could kill his own mother. I'm sure your mother's physician can prescribe something appropriate, Hannah said carefully. I want to make it myself as a gift. You just need to tell me which herbs to use. I couldn't possibly advise on medicine for your mother, Master Edward. That's beyond my knowledge. His expression hardened. Don't lie to me. You know every plant on this estate, what they do, how to use them. Everyone says so. People exaggerate. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Make me the tea, or I'll tell. Father, you've been entering the main house at night, stealing things. I'll tell him I saw you in his study going through his papers. The threat was brilliant and devastating. Hannah had thought herself clever by leaving no evidence of her nighttime intrusion, but she hadn't accounted for the possibility that someone, this child monster had seen her, had been watching, had held that information in reserve for exactly this kind of leverage. If he made that accusation, Edward would search her room. He would find the stolen key. He would assume she had been responsible for all the deaths that she had been gathering information to blackmail him. She would be executed within days. I saw you, Edward Jr., continued reading her expression. I was in Margaret's room that night. I saw you go into Father's study. I watched you read his letters. I know you know things." Hannah felt the walls closing in, the trap tightening around her with mechanical inevitability. She could refuse and be exposed. She could comply and help him kill Catherine. Neither choice was survivable, but perhaps there was a third option. "I'll make the tea," she said slowly, "but I'll need to gather fresh herbs from the garden. It will take me a little while." His smile returned. "That's fine. I'll wait here." Anna left the kitchen, moving toward the garden with forced calm, despite the panic screaming through her mind. She needed to do something. But what? If she ran, they would catch her. If she called for help, Edward Jr. would make his accusations. If she made the tea with harmful herbs, he might test it on someone else first, or she might be blamed for the poisoning regardless. She reached the garden and knelt beside the herbs, her hands shaking as she picked chamomile, mint, and lavender, all harmless, all appropriate for nausea. But as she worked, she noticed someone standing near the garden's edge, watching her. Thomas Barrett. Their eyes met, and Hannah made a decision born of absolute desperation. She stood, walked directly to him, and spoke before fear could stop her. "Mr. Barrett, I need to tell you something." "Master Edward Jr. asked me to make a medicinal tea for Mrs. Collier. I think he means to poison her." Barrett's expression shifted from surprise to suspicion. "That's a serious accusation." "I know, sir, but I think he's been responsible for all the deaths. I think he's been using his mother's medicines to kill people, and now he's planning to kill her." She could see him calculating, assessing her credibility against the impossibility of what she was claiming. A 9-year-old child, a serial killer, testimony from a slave. Every element argued against believing her. I found his initial carved into the still room doorframe. Hannah continued desperately. "He's been accessing his mother's medicines. He told me things about the deaths, things only the killer would know. Please, Mr. Barrett, I know you have no reason to trust me, but Mrs. Collier's life is in danger right now." Barrett was silent for a long moment. Then, "Wait here." He strode towards the main house, disappearing inside. Hannah remained frozen in the garden, herbs clutched in her hands, unsure whether she had just saved Catherine's life or signed her own death warrant. 20 minutes later, Barrett emerged from the house with Edward Collier. The two men walked directly to the kitchen where Edward Jr. was still waiting. Hannah, watching from the garden, saw the boy's expression change from confidence to alarm as his father entered and began speaking to him in tones too low to carry. The conversation lasted several minutes. Then Edward emerged, his face gray, and went back into the main house. Barrett followed. Edward Jr., looking furious, was escorted away by one of the house servants. Anna waited, hardly breathing, until Dina came running to the garden. "Anna, Mr. Barrett wants to see you in the main house, he says. He says you need to explain everything." Anna followed Dina down the corridor, each step suspended between dread and hope. She could not decide whether she was walking toward judgment or deliverance. Barrett and Edward were waiting in the study. The physician who had been attending Catherine stood near the hearth, hands folded, his expression grave. "Hannah," Barrett said formally, "tell them what you told me. Everything about Master Edward Jr. and the deaths." So she spoke. Not every detail. She said nothing of the stolen key, nor of the night spent searching through Edward's papers. She did not confess to her quiet alterations in the still room, but she described the pattern, the strange sequence of deaths, the missing arsenic, the carved initial, the boy's unsettling curiosity about poisons, his questions, his behavior. Finally, she told them about his confession and his demand that she help him poison Catherine. As she spoke, Edward's face shifted from disbelief to dawning horror. When she finished, he turned sharply to the physician. Could a child do this? The older man nodded slowly. There are documented cases. Disturbed youths who harm without remorse. Rare, but not unheard of. The pattern she describes is consistent. You were searching for adult motives: money, revenge, passion. A child's motives are different: immediate, emotional, impulsive. Why did no one suspect him? Edward demanded. Because we are conditioned not to, the physician replied gently. We do not want to believe children capable of such darkness, and a clever child who understands that can act with alarming confidence. Edward began pacing, fists clenched. Hannah saw the strain in his face, the collapse of certainty, the unbearable implication that his daughter had died by his son's hand. At last he stopped and faced her. Why did you not come forward sooner? This was the most dangerous question of all. Hannah lowered her gaze and chose her words with care. Sir, I did not understand the truth until recently, and when I began to suspect, I had no proof. Accusations without evidence would have led to my punishment, not his. I tried to gather information quietly, but I was warned against asking questions. When Master Edward Jr. confessed, I knew my word alone would mean nothing. I sought a way to protect others without condemning myself. It was near enough to the truth. You knew my son was a murderer, Edward said, voice tight, and you were silent. I had no safe way to speak, sir, not until he tried to use me to harm Mrs. Collier. Then I had no choice but to tell Mr. Barrett, even knowing it might cost me. You should have come to me at once. Yes, sir. She accepted the rebuke. To argue would be fatal. Barrett intervened. She came to me at considerable personal risk. Given her position, I believe she acted as wisely as circumstances allowed. Edward did not argue, though his jaw remained rigid. He turned back to the physician. What do we do with Edward Jr.? There are institutions, the physician said carefully. Facilities for troubled youth. He must be removed immediately, for his own sake and for the safety of everyone here. If Hannah's account is accurate, and I believe it is, your son will kill again if given opportunity. Pain crossed Edward's face, but he nodded. Make the arrangements. Within the week, somewhere distant, somewhere secure. Barrett hesitated. And the deaths? Do we inform the authorities? Silence settled heavily over the room. Anna could see the calculation behind Edward's eyes. Public truth meant scandal. Investigation, questions about his family's stability, legal consequences, the collapse of reputation. We will report T. Hat. The deaths were examined and determined to be tragic accidents and illness, Edward said at last. Nothing further. Catherine has suffered enough. Margaret's memory deserves dignity. And Lily? Barrett asked. Edward's expression hardened. Hannah, you are certain she was not involved? Yes, sir. Master Edward Jr. told me he framed her. Then she deserves proper burial. Barrett, see that her remains are moved. Mark her grave. It was a small act of justice, but Hannah felt something loosen in her chest. Edward looked at her once more. You have served this family faithfully in difficult circumstances. I will remember that. Return to your duties. Dismissal and reprieve in a single sentence. 5 nights later, Edward Jr. was sent away to an institution in Pennsylvania. He departed under cover of darkness to avoid scrutiny. From her kitchen window, Hannah watched the carriage disappear into the night, carrying with it the truth of what had occurred at Riverside Estate. The official account was simple: tragic illness, unfortunate accidents, the natural sorrows of plantation life, Samuel's age, Ruth's complications, Jonas's supposed food poisoning, Margaret's sudden decline, Lily's grief-stricken suicide. A tidy story, plausible, entirely false. Among the enslaved community, however, the real story traveled quietly, through glances, murmured conversations, and unspoken understanding. Hannah's role was known without being named. Her courage, and the peril she had navigated, became part of a hidden history beneath the estate's official records. Catherine recovered slowly, clinging fiercely to her unborn child. She never addressed Hannah directly about the truth, yet small gestures began appearing in the kitchen. Extra fabric, a warmer blanket, jars of preserves from her private stores. Gratitude expressed without words. Edward changed as well. He grew quieter, premature, lie-aged by the knowledge of his son's crimes. Financial pressures that once dominated his concerns seemed smaller beside what he now carried. His marriage cooled into shared silence. Two people bound by grief neither could voice. The estate continued, cotton planted and harvested. The sugar venture, abandoned after another failed year. Debts extended, land mortgaged, hope deferred, and Hannah remained in her kitchen. She survived by being observant, by gathering knowledge, by understanding how power moved across the plantation like an invisible current. Yet survival had required silence, while others died. She had waited for proof while Jonas suffered, while Margaret perished, while Lily bore false blame. Her confession had saved Catherine, but too late for the others. Was she a survivor who had done all she could within impossible limits, or was she complicit in deaths she might have prevented had she risked herself sooner? She did not know. What she did know was this: in a world structured by slavery, justice was never complete. Power flowed according to skin and ownership, not truth or merit. Sometimes survival itself was the only victory available. She continued her work among the herbs and plants that grew around the estate. The knowledge of poisons, how they worked, how they could be disguised, remained locked in her mind. She would never use it. But she would never surrender it either. In a life where she controlled almost nothing, that knowledge was a strange and silent insurance, a reminder that even within chains, the mind could remain unconquered. She carried the estate's darkest truths inside her: Margaret's murder, Edward Jr.'s nature, Edward's desperation, Catherine's fragility. She alone understood the full shape of 1841. Most of those truths would die with her. To speak them openly would invite danger and accomplish little. So she bore witness, in silence, navigating the perilous space between discretion and survival, with knowledge as her shield. The kitchen remained her domain, small, sweltering, relentless. She prepared meals for people who did not see her as fully human. But she saw them clearly. She understood more than they imagined. And she would remember, even if history never recorded her name. The cook who knew every poison in the house had endured. And in enduring,